Hi, my name is Cameron Delano, and this is a history of horror. Have you ever watched a movie, or read a book, or played a video game and felt that in real life you weren't as safe as you actually are? Have you ever been alone in a dark room and felt that you weren't alone? That something might just be around the corner waiting to strike? That's scary, right? Maybe you're not as paranoid as I am, but this behavior is derived from the tropes we observe in horror. As someone who probably watches too many horror movies, I hope this speech will shed light on an art style that many aren't familiar with. And hey, maybe you don't like horror, but you do get scared like just like every other human for as long as people have been around. By discussing horror, the history and evolution of horror as a whole, I intend to help you understand the first works, the evolution of these works, and how horror has evolved over time. I will begin by discussing the first semblances of horror in writing. After that, I will tell you about early horror on screen. I'll conclude with an overview of contemporary horror in film and literature and other forms of media. Horror is very old. According to Paul Patterson, an English professor at St. Joseph's University, in the first century they wrote letters recounting ghost stories they have claimed to have witnessed, chains rattling, haunted house type stories. Early writers like Pliny the Younger and Petronius contributed to early tropes in horror, like the haunted house and the creature feature, with horrific ghosts and shape-shifting werewolves in the forefront. Horror became more popular with the creation of Gothic horror in the 18th century. The genre was invented by Horace Walpole with his novel The Castle of Otranto, published in 1765. Writers like Mary Shelley introduced a scientific element to horror with her novel Frankenstein, published in 1818. A more elevated form of horror was employed by writers such as E.T.A. Hoffman and Edgar Allan Poe, using doubles and specters as well as psychological symbolism and everyday reality to create a sort of sense of credibility for the things they wrote about. In the 20th century, Gothic horror was refreshed by writers such as H.P. Lovecraft and Stephen King, who combined fantasy and science fiction with horror. Eventually, advances in technology, early filmmakers were using horror stories of the past as well as moving pictures were able to create the foundation of what we now call the scary movie. According to the New York Film Academy, the first horror film was created in 1898 by French filmmaker Georges Méliès. It was titled The Le Manoir du Diable, or The House of the Devil. It wasn't very scary, but it paved the way for classical horror movies like Frankenstein, Dracula, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and Nosferatu. Many of these early films were adapted from Gothic horror novels, dubbing this era in time the Golden Age of horror. As we go to the 20th century, we find many different eras, which feature some of our favorite movies. The atomic years of the 40s and 50s gave us Godzilla. The cold era of the 70s and 80s gave us Exorcist and The Omen. And the slasher era of the mid 70s and 80s gave us Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, and Nightmare on Elm Street. Now that you know the past of horror, let's talk about the present and how much it has changed. As you know now, nowadays they have reboot after reboot of older movies, many of which have not been very good. Some movies like Hereditary, Cabin in the Woods, and The Babadook, however, have made a refreshing addition to horror as a genre. According to the reporter, people's acceptance of horror in the past few years has been attributed to elevated horror, a subgenre of horror that focuses more on the artistic side of horror. Similarly to movies, video games have developed as distinct genres in horror, such as games like Silent Hill belong to the psychological horror genre, Resident Evil with the action horror genre, and Five Nights at Freddy's with the jump scare genre. Now you have some movies to watch and some games to play over the weekend. In closing, I have just covered the first appearances of horror in writing, early horror on screen, and an overview of contemporary horror in film and literature. I hope this speech discussing horror history has helped you understand the first works, the evolution of these works, and how horror has evolved over time. The next time you watch a scary movie, just take a moment to think of how far it has come to where it has been as a genre. Thank you.